At last we're here to 4.9, the lesson where we finally get to put together all of the pieces of monetary policy, the money supply, open market operations, what happens to interest rates, and most importantly, how these impact the economy, which is the entire point. Understanding how it is that the Fed can use monetary policy to stabilize the economy. And as you can probably imagine, the next step after this is bringing back in fiscal policy and looking at that combination. So what can the Fed do and what can Congress do? So to review really quickly, these are the monetary policy tools. To fight inflation, the Fed can use an easy money or an expansionary monetary policy. That's all easy money means. It means that the money supply is being expanded. So those three policies would be the reserve requirement. If you recall from a couple of days ago, if we decrease the reserve requirement, that means banks have more excess reserves, they can do more lending, and there's more money in the general money supply. We can use open market operations, and hopefully you recall that we said if the Fed buys bonds, that will increase the money supply as well. And with the discount rate, the key is to lower it to make it cheaper to borrow money. Fighting inflation, we can use tight money policy, which means imagine the Fed holding on tight to the money, or contractionary, which means we're shrinking the money supply. With these, if we increase the reserve requirement, that means banks have to hold on to more of the cash, and there's just less available for lending to the general public. Open market operations, if the Fed sells bonds, if the banks and the public hold more bonds, they have less cash. And the interest rate, the discount rate, if they increase it, that makes it more expensive for people to borrow money, and that will also reduce the money supply. So we have 3 ways here to increase the money supply and 3 ways here to decrease the money supply. So in reality, that reserve requirement, it hasn't changed since 1980. So that's really not a policy tool that the Fed uses. The discount rate changes a few times a year, maybe, and by, a percentage rate point or 2. But mostly, what the Fed does is work through these open market operations. And they call it interest rate targeting. And the interest rate they are targeting is the federal funds rate, the one banks charge each other. Because if the Fed subtly makes more money available by buying bonds, and banks have more excess reserves, then they'll charge each other less. There won't be as much of a shortage of funds out there for those overnight loans. So the Fed doesn't set the federal funds rate, it's through its open market operations. So we're going to look at this a couple different ways to see how it works. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting the slides to advance. A little bit of slowness on my program here. So this is there's really 2 ways of looking at it here. When the Fed is buying and selling bonds, we can look at the interest rate change in a couple of different ways. So first of all, this money market graph, right? This should look familiar. We've already learned the money market. We have the nominal interest rate here on the y-axis, quantity of money on the x-axis. The money supply is a vertical line because the money supply here is being set by the Fed. And if the Fed buys bonds, when the Fed buys bonds, that literally puts cash into people's hands, and it puts more cash in the excess reserves of banks. That directly increases the money supply, and we can see that it causes the interest rate to fall. In this case, the interest rate falls from 8% to 6%. And we can record that in flowchart form here too. Fed buys bonds, money supply goes up, interest rate goes down. And again, this is the nominal interest rate. But another way of looking at this is trying to figure out what actually happens with bonds. So why is this happening? We're going to just spend a little detour here talking a little bit more about bonds and interest rates. So the way a bond works, a bond has something called a face value, okay, which is the initial issue price. So if the federal government issues a $1,000 bond, the initial purchaser would pay $1,000 and the U.S. government would get the $1,000, right, with a promise that they would be repaid later. That happens with corporate bonds and city municipal bonds and other bonds as well. So the face value is the amount that was originally the original price. There's also an annual coupon payment. And by the way, what we're talking about here are something called bearer bonds. There are lots of different kinds of bonds, but bearer bonds mean they can be resold. They don't have anyone's name printed on them. They can be cashed in by whoever happens to be carrying them or bearing them at the time. So the annual coupon payment on this sample bond is $50. And that means that every year, whoever has this bond in hand gets paid $50, which means they have an annual interest rate of 5%. So let's think about this. If the Fed is buying bonds, if the Fed is buying bonds, you can imagine a very simple supply and demand here, right, for bonds. So price, quantity, supply, demand, and oops, my D didn't turn out very well. And the Fed buys bonds. That increases the demand, or you could look at it as decreasing the supply, right? There's not as many available out there. So the interest rate, or I'm sorry, the price of bonds goes up. That resale price goes up. So it doesn't actually change, interestingly, it doesn't change the face value, and it doesn't change the coupon payment, but it changes the interest rate, because although the face value still says $1,000, the person who owns the bond now didn't pay $1,000 for it. They might have paid, say, $2,000 for it. So that's like that's to the individual who owns it. That's their interpretation of face value. Because of the increase in demand, the Fed's buying bonds, price of bonds goes up, and the face value to the owner seems to be higher. So now what's the interest rate? Well, they're still getting paid $50 a year, but they paid $2,000, so their interest rate is now a mere 2.5%. So you can see from this simple equation that there's going to always be an inverse relationship between the price of bonds and the interest rate, because the price of bonds is going to be in the denominator here. So what happens if the Fed is selling bonds? Well, let's erase this for a second. Okay, and let's imagine a scenario where instead of buying bonds, the Fed is selling bonds. I bet you can guess what's going to happen to the price of bonds. The Fed is selling bonds based on simple supply and demand. The Fed is selling, that means there's going to be a much greater number of them out there. So what's going to happen to the price of bonds? It will fall. So this bond, for example, might now be available for $500. The person who buys it for $500 still gets paid $50 a year. That means their actual return is 10%, because 50 divided by 500 gives you the 10% return. So when the Fed is buying bonds, bond prices go up, right? The price of a bond goes up. Oops, doesn't want me to do that. Okay, the price of a bond goes up, but the interest rate that the bonds are paying goes down. If the Fed is selling bonds, the price of a bond goes down, the price goes down, and the interest rate goes up. So let's bring that back to our graphs here, or I guess to our flowchart. Bond prices and interest rates are inversely related. So the Fed buys bonds, bond prices go up, interest rates go down. You can pause for a moment and fill another side and then check it. The Fed sells bonds, bond prices go down, and interest rates go up. So we really want to understand and memorize and understand those particular flowchart relationships. The interesting thing is that although the Fed is merely targeting the federal funds rate, the federal funds rate is going to affect all of the other interest rates. And this graph just shows us that from 1994 to 2003, so over nearly a 20-year span, the federal funds rate and the prime interest rate, the rate that's charged to banks' best customers, right, the big corporate customers, the people who are really reliable about paying back, those essentially completely mimicked each other. The only difference between them, the 3%, is the bank's profit. So again, interest rates move together like a hand. The lowest one, the pinky, if it goes down, they all go down. If it goes up, they all go up. So looking at this from a graphical perspective again, we have the money market here on the left. If we are at this money supply, we have an interest rate, as it says up here, of 8%. We have a money supply of 150, let's say, $1 billion. That's what it says down here. And if we increase the money supply, right, if we increase the money supply over here to this one, which is being called MS3 here, this is MS2, okay, the interest rate falls, as we said, right? And if you carry this over to this investment demand curve, which you learned at the beginning of Unit 2, and which is incorporated in the loanable funds market, you can see that when the interest rate falls from 8% to 6%, the quantity of investment increases. And this is going to be really important because investment is a component of aggregate demand. So the Fed can essentially decide to buy bonds. Buying bonds increases the money supply and lowers the interest rate. And the lower interest rate provides an incentive for business firms to invest more, which shifts aggregate demand to the right. If, on the other hand, the Fed decides to sell bonds, we'll see the exact opposite happen, right? If the Fed decides to sell bonds, we move from this to this money supply, right? And we see the interest rate goes up. And when the interest rate goes up, over here on the investment demand graph, we go from $20 billion of investment at 8% interest to $15 billion at 10% interest. So the Fed can quickly reduce aggregate demand by selling bonds, raising interest rates, causing investment to fall, causing aggregate demand to shift to the left. So if we put this all together, and it's a little bit hard to see, right, because they're kind of crammed on here, this is called Keynesian monetary policy. So again, John Maynard Keynes, he believed in interventionist fiscal and monetary policy, and these are called the transmission graphs. And all that means is that we're transmitting the change in one graph to the next graph and showing how changes in the money supply affect interest rates, how interest rates affect investment, and how investment affects aggregate demand, which of course ultimately affects output and price levels. So we have a lot of things going on here, everything from Unit 4 wrapped in here together. So we'll just walk through an expansionary monetary policy. Let's imagine that our economy is in a recession, and we're going to provide this Keynesian aggregate supply curve, right? So we have this flat portion of the aggregate supply curve, and we're right here at AD1. Okay, and at AD1, investment is, and it's a little bit hard to see here, but at AD1, investment is only 15 billion, okay, and the money supply is MS1. So what should we do? The Fed should buy bonds. If the Fed buys bonds, that will cause the bond prices to go up, interest rates to fall, money supply to rise. So money supply on this graph, we show the money supply increasing, and we show the interest rate falling. So because of the increase in the money supply, the interest rate has dropped from 10% to 8%. As a result, okay, so step number 1 is increase the money supply. Step number 2 is interest rates fall. Step number 3 is investment increases. Okay, and step number 4 is because of the increase in investment, we now have an increase in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand shifts, right? And then we have an increased output level, and because we're in a horizontal range, we don't even have any inflation. We don't have an increased price level. So that would be a Keynesian transmission of an expansionary monetary policy. A contractionary policy, you can work your way through this and you can imagine it would do just exactly the opposite. If we're over here and we're experiencing inflation, your goal is to bring down aggregate demand. So think about, what should I do with bonds, buy or sell? What will happen to the money supply? And keep in mind, we're starting over here, right? If our problem is inflation, we're starting with this high money supply and this low interest rate. So what can I do? What do I need to do to the bonds? What do I need to do to the money supply? What will happen to interest rates? What will happen to investment? And then what will happen to aggregate demand, price level, and output? Very quickly, the Fed's main purpose, well, they've had a dual mandate, as you know, to promote maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates, but they primarily work on stabilizing prices. Their primary goal is to fight inflation, and we'll talk more about that, why that is, in the next video.